Good morning, my lady. May I just check that you can see us and hear us?
I can. Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Blackwell. Good morning, everyone. This morning we begin the first preliminary hearing for our final module, Module 10, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on society. By the time I reach the hearings for Module 10 in early 2026, the inquiry will have gathered and I will have heard a great deal of evidence on the impact of the pandemic and the response to it on society. I will be assisted by that evidence in making my findings and any recommendations in Module 10. However, the evidence gathered to date will not suffice to fulfil my terms of reference. We have yet to gather, and I have yet to hear, important additional evidence relating to various groups of people specified in my terms of reference. Moreover, where I have heard evidence relating to a specific group, for example, the bereaved, there remain issues that we must explore in greater detail. I shall now ask Ms. Kate Blackwell, King's Counsel, to outline the approach the inquiry team intends to adopt in conducting Module 10 and any issues I need to decide at this stage. I shall then hear from any call participants. Ms. Blackwell.
Thank you, my lady. Module 10 of the inquiry concerns the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on society, as my lady has already said, with a particular focus on the experiences of key workers, the most vulnerable and the bereaved. I appear this morning along with the other members of the council team, my learned friends, Miss Rahman, King's Counsel, Miss Vitae, Mr. Phipps and Mr. Dowjay. In accordance with the agenda for today's preliminary hearing, I will address the following 6 areas. First, some practical arrangements, and I will address the designation of core participants. Second, the provisional outline of scope for Module 10. Third, the inquiry's approach to gathering information and evidence, which will include the following: roundtable events, a systematic evidence review, expert material and the instruction of expert witnesses, Rule 9 requests, and every story matters and its role within Module 10. Fourth, the disclosure process for core participants. Fifth, future hearing dates and next steps. And sixth, and finally, the submissions received from core participants. There will then be an opportunity for those who have been designated as core participants to make submissions if they wish to do so. My lady, pursuant to Rule 5 of the Inquiry Rules of 2006, the following 14 applicants were designated as core participants for Module 10. I introduce them and their representatives in no particular order. COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice, represented by Ms. Stone. Northern Ireland COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice, represented by Ms. McDermott. COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice Cymru, represented by Mr. Stanton. Scottish COVID Bereaved, represented by Dr. Mitchell, King's Counsel. Clinically Vulnerable Families, represented by Mr. Wagner. The Disabled People's Organisation, represented by Miss Beattie. The DA Group, represented by Miss Davis, King's Counsel. Shelter, represented by Mr. Westgate, King's Counsel. The Justice Sector Coalition, represented by Miss Monroe, King's Counsel. The Prison and Immigration Detention Advocacy Group, represented by Mr. O'Cally, King's Counsel. The Migrants Group Consortium, represented by Miss Moffat. The Trades Union Congress, represented by Miss Peacock. The Local Government Association, the Welsh Local Government Association, and the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, represented by Miss Stober, and Mind, represented by Miss Livermore. A full list of core participants in Module 10 and their legal representatives will be published on the inquiry website in due course. Turning then to the practical arrangements for today's hearing, the proceedings are being recorded and live streamed to other locations. This allows the hearing to be followed by a greater number of people than would be able to be accommodated within the hearing room, which satisfies the obligations set out in Section 18 of the Inquiries Act for My Lady to take such steps as you consider reasonable to ensure that members of the public are able to attend and see and hear a simultaneous transmission of the proceedings. In addition, as is routine in public inquiries, the broadcasting of this hearing will be conducted with a 3-minute delay. This provides the opportunity for the feed to be paused if anything unexpected is aired, which should not be. We don't expect this to arise over the course of today, but I mention it so that those who are following proceedings from further afield can understand the reasons for any such short delay. I have already set out the names of those organisations which have been granted core participant status for Module 10. For those who were either not granted core participant status, or for those who did not apply to be a designated core participant, I wish to reiterate that not being a core participant in no way precludes any person, entity, or group from participating in the following ways: bringing any matter to the attention of the inquiry, providing the inquiry with relevant information and evidence, where appropriate and relevant, giving evidence at a hearing, where upon receipt of an invitation, attending a round table organised by the inquiry, and in the case of an individual affected by the pandemic, taking part in the inquiry's nationwide listening exercise, Every Story Matters. My Lady, I will now turn to address the scope of Module 10 and then the evidence gathering and investigation stage that has already begun for the module. The provisional outline for scope. The societal impact of the COVID-19 pandemic was profound and far-reaching, altering almost every aspect of daily life in the United Kingdom. The pandemic reshaped social interactions, mental health, community cohesion, and access to public services. From the strictest periods of national lockdowns to the gradual reopening of society, individuals and communities faced unprecedented restrictions, hardships, and uncertainty, with some consequences that continue to be felt today. There will be few, if any, individuals or groups who are unaffected by the consequences of the pandemic. The challenges extended from key workers who served on the front line at significant personal risk, to those in communal or institutional settings who faced severe restrictions on their daily lives. The bereaved families who lost loved ones in exceptionally difficult and often isolating circumstances endured profound grief. For many, this was compounded by the lack of ability to perform their traditional rites of mourning and the lack of social support structures that are so fundamental to the human experience. The pandemic had disproportionate effects on different parts of society. The clinically vulnerable and clinically extremely vulnerable were required to shield for prolonged periods, often in isolation, raising concerns about mental health, loneliness, and access to essential services. Those living in temporary or overcrowded housing or experiencing homelessness encountered particular difficulties in adhering to public health guidance, while victims of domestic abuse were placed at even greater risk due to lockdown measures that made it harder to seek help or escape unsafe environments. The justice system was also significantly affected, with court closures, delays, and restrictions on visits to prisons and immigration detention centres, leaving many isolated in periods of uncertainty. The mental health and well-being of the population was also impacted by the pandemic, with effects exacerbated by social isolation, financial insecurity, loss of routine, and fear of the virus. The restrictions on social, cultural, and religious life had a deep impact on individuals and communities. The closure of places of worship, community centres, sports facilities, theatres and other cultural spaces disrupted fundamental aspects of social and spiritual life, with consequences for mental health, social bonds and community cohesion. The restrictions on travel, leisure and hospitality not only had a significant economic impact, but also disrupted the way people engaged with society, family and friends. Many individuals were unable to visit sick or elderly relatives, or to travel to and to attend significant life events, or say farewell to loved ones in their final moments. For some, this compounded feelings of grief, loneliness and frustration. However, the pandemic also brought about extraordinary acts of resilience, solidarity, and community innovation. Many individuals, organisations, and local communities mobilised themselves to support those in need. The role of charities and the voluntary sector more generally was vital in helping those facing financial or social hardship. Communities adapted to maintain social and cultural connections, with many moving services online, accelerating digital transformation and providing new ways of connecting. The inquiry will examine such examples of societal adaptation and collective resilience, ensuring that any positive lessons learned can also inform the UK's preparedness for future crises. The inquiry will maintain a focus on the key themes and issues emerging from the evidence. The impact of the pandemic on society was vast and multifaceted. The wide scope of the module necessitates efficient use of investigative time to ensure these themes are effectively examined. The provisional outline of scope for Module 10, which has been published on the inquiry website in both English and Welsh, states as follows. Module 10 is the final module of the COVID-19 UK inquiry and, in accordance with its terms of reference, will examine the impact of COVID on the population of the United Kingdom, with a particular focus on key workers, the most vulnerable, the bereaved, mental health and well-being. It will investigate the impact of the pandemic and the measures put in place to combat the disease and any disproportionate impact. The module will also seek to identify where societal strengths, resilience and/or innovation reduced any adverse impact. Module 10 will therefore examine the impact of the pandemic and the measures put in place on the following. 1. The general population of the UK, including the impact on mental health and well-being of the population. This will include the community-level impact on sport and leisure and cultural institutions, and the societal impact of the closure and opening restrictions imposed on the hospitality, retail, travel and tourism industries. It will also cover the impact of restrictions on worship resulting from the closure and reopening of places of worship. 2. Key workers, excluding health and social care workers, but including those working in the police service, fire and rescue workers, teachers, cleaners, transport workers, taxi and delivery drivers, funeral workers, security guards, and public-facing sales and retail workers. It will cover the impact of implementing government decisions, any inequality in the impact of interventions, including lockdown, testing and workplace safety, and any inequality in the impact on health outcomes, such as infections, mortality, and mental and physical well-being. 3. The most vulnerable, including those outlined in the inquiry's equality statement, as well as the clinically vulnerable and clinically extremely vulnerable. It will include the following topics: housing and homelessness, safeguarding and support for victims of domestic abuse, those within the immigration and asylum system, those within prisons and other places of detention, and those affected by the operation of the justice system. And 4, the bereaved, including restrictions on arrangements for funeral and burials and post-bereavement support. The scope remains provisional and will continue to be reflected upon as evidence is received throughout the Module 10 investigation. The Module 10 team is also mindful of other modules investigations that may touch upon issues relevant to the impact of the pandemic on society. This includes, although is not limited to, Module 3, which has dealt with the impact of the pandemic on healthcare systems, Module 8, which addresses children and young people, and Module 9, which will look at the economic response to the pandemic. The inquiry teams will continue to work together to avoid any unnecessary duplication. However, whilst the scope remains provisional, to assist core participants, we have identified questions that the inquiry is likely to consider in Module 10. This will be expanded upon in the list of issues which will be circulated ahead of the final hearings for Module 10. These questions include the following. How did the general adult population's mental health and well-being change during the pandemic? What were the risk factors for the development of mild to moderate anxiety and depression, and were there any protective factors? Were there inequalities in terms of the impact within and between different demographic groups? What were the changes in symptoms during the pandemic for individuals with severe mental health conditions, including those in communal and institutional settings? Was there a treatment gap in providing services to people with diagnosed and severe mental health conditions? What was the impact of the pandemic on physical activity levels of the population? What were the consequences of closures and restrictions on sports, leisure and cultural institutions? How did the closure and reopening of places of worship affect religious practices, and how did faith groups and places of worship adapt to the changes brought about by the pandemic? What was the societal impact of the closure and reopening restrictions on the hospitality, retail, travel and tourism industries? Were key workers disproportionately impacted by the pandemic in terms of infections, mortality rates and physical and mental health outcomes? What was the impact of increased workloads, staff shortages, and having to isolate from family members on the general well-being of key workers? And were there disparities in that impact across different key worker groups and different demographic groups of key workers? What was the impact of the pandemic and measures put in place on the most vulnerable in society, including the impact on access to support services? What was the impact of the pandemic on the bereaved, including access to support services for the bereaved? And which innovations or changes in practice which emerged during the pandemic, if any, could inform future pandemic responses? The inquiry is grateful for the additional questions and issues suggested by core participants in their written submissions. These contributions, informed as they are by core participants' expertise and the lived experience of their memories, are invaluable in shaping the inquiry's approach. I would like to clarify that the questions which I've just outlined are intended to provide only an illustrative list of issues that Module 10 is likely to consider, rather than an exhaustive list. As the inquiry's work progresses, this list will be developed and expanded to ensure that Module 10 comprehensively addresses the full range of relevant matters. The Module 10 team have carefully considered and will continue to consider the submissions of core participants on key issues, and where appropriate, they will be incorporated into areas for investigation. It is, however, important to also clarify that some of the proposed questions and issues so far suggested fall outside the provisional scope for Module 10 and are therefore unlikely to be included in this module's investigation. For example, decision-making processes. Some submissions suggest questions that relate to the decision-making process within government, how decisions were made, whether they were appropriate, and whether certain decisions should have been made differently. This falls outside of the scope of Module 10, which will not address decision-making, but rather focus on the impact of restrictions on the general population. Issues beyond the relevant period of investigation. Some submissions raise issues that extend beyond the time frame covered by Module 10 and therefore are unlikely to be included within this module's scope. And the impact on children and young people. Where questions relate specifically to the impact of the pandemic on children and young people, these will also fall outside the remit of this module, given that the inquiry has a specific module considering children and young people, that is Module 8. The inquiry remains committed to a thorough and inclusive investigation within the scope of Module 10. Core participants' contributions continue to be a crucial part of this process, and the inquiry looks forward to engaging further on the issues that fall within the module's remit. My lady, a number of core participants have provided detailed written submissions regarding the provisional outline of scope for Module 10. And these submissions reflect the breadth of issues covered within this module and the importance of ensuring that all aspects of societal impact are thoroughly investigated. The inquiry has carefully considered these submissions and will continue to do so. In many instances, they align with the inquiry's planned approach. Some submissions raise points of clarification or refinement, while others advocate for additional areas of investigation. The inquiry is mindful that Module 10 serves as the final module of the inquiry, and as such, core participants have expressed a strong desire to ensure that any gaps are addressed before the conclusion of the inquiry's work. Given the breadth of issues raised, it's not practical to address all points of detail today. However, I will highlight the most significant themes and concerns emerging from the core participant submissions, each of whom will, of course, have the opportunity to expand on their positions during their oral submissions today. So first, the effect of the pandemic and lockdown. The DA Group has submitted that the inquiry's framing of its investigation should explicitly recognise that the pandemic and lockdown were distinct events, each contributing to harm in different ways. They argue that lockdown was not simply an inevitable byproduct of the pandemic, but was a policy decision that had its own distinct and measurable effects on individuals and communities. The inquiry recognises that the pandemic and the measures implemented in response to it, such as lockdowns, must be examined together. However, as lockdowns were a consequence of the pandemic, my lady may consider that the existing language of the provisional outline of scope, which refers to the impact of the pandemic and the measures put in place to combat the disease, sufficiently encapsulates this. Nonetheless, should the investigation reveal that a clearer distinction is necessary, this could be reflected. Long-term and ongoing effect of the pandemic. Several core participants, including the Prison and Immigration Detention Advocacy Group, Clinical Vulnerable Families, and the Trades Union Congress, have urged the inquiry to extend its examination beyond the immediate pandemic period to include the ongoing long-term impact of COVID-19. They have emphasised the need to consider the following: the lasting effects of COVID-19 on the prison estate and immigration detention, the long-term health, employment and financial consequences for clinically vulnerable people, and the disproportionate and enduring impact of long COVID, particularly on key workers. The inquiry's terms of reference state that it will examine, consider and report on preparations and the response to the pandemic in England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, up to and including the inquiry's formal setting up date, which was the 28th of June 2022. However, Module 10's focus on impact may include an assessment of the likely impact which may extend beyond the above date, for example, in relation to ongoing or long-term impact. Mental health and well-being. The inquiry's focus on mental health in Module 10 has been positively received by Mind, the Disabled People's Organisations and the DA Group. These organisations have requested that the investigation explicitly examines community mental health services and not just hospital-based services. The impact of the pandemic on all mental health conditions rather than just severe mental health conditions be addressed. That the proportionate impact of the pandemic on disabled people's mental health is specifically considered, and that the inquiry assess how the provision and accessibility of mental health care changed during the pandemic. The inquiry has already sought expert evidence regarding the operation of mental health services at all levels, including community-based care, and the systemic evidence review will also consider disparities in mental health outcomes between demographic groups. Given this, My Lady may consider that the inquiry remains committed to fully exploring these issues. The general population, integrating the experiences of disabled and clinically vulnerable people. The disabled people's organisations and clinically vulnerable families have expressed concern that the experiences of disabled and clinically vulnerable people should not be treated as separate from the general population. The inquiry recognises that issues of disability and clinical vulnerability must be fully considered throughout the investigation, rather than being confined to a single section. This has already been considered in the design of the information and evidence gathering process for Module 10, and therefore My Lady may consider that the current framework is flexible enough to capture these concerns. Economic impact. The DA Group has urged the inquiry to consider the economic effects of the pandemic, particularly on those in casual, insecure or informal employment, and those who experienced an increase in debt. The economic response to the pandemic is primarily within the remit of Module 9, but that being said, Module 10 recognises it is inevitable that information will be received that touches upon the economic and financial impacts of the pandemic. With respect to key workers, this will likely include the financial impact on key workers, including issues related to sick pay, furlough, and wages to the extent that these impacted on the well-being of key workers. In light of this, your ladyship may consider that the existing scope sufficiently addresses economic hardship within the context of key workers. And onto key workers themselves, whilst the provisional outline of scope includes teachers, police, fire and rescue workers, cleaners, transport workers, taxi and delivery drivers, funeral workers, security guards, and public-facing retail workers, several core participants have argued that this list does not fully capture the breadth of key workers who ensured society continued to function during the pandemic. Amongst others, it has been suggested that the provisional scope ought to be updated to explicitly include homelessness services workers, as suggested by Shelter, early years and educational workers rather than just teachers, and logistics and delivery workers rather than just delivery drivers, as suggested by the Trades Union Congress. My Lady, the list of key workers explicitly listed in the provisional outline of scope is not intended to be exhaustive. As a result, My Lady may reasonably consider that no further refinements are necessary. The fact that a key worker is not explicitly listed in the provisional outline of scope does not mean they will not be considered in the module's investigation. Several core participants have pointed to significant disparities in how different groups of key workers experience the pandemic and have highlighted key concerns which warrant consideration when considering the impact on key workers. The inquiry is grateful for these submissions and will take these considerations into account. The most vulnerable. Several core participants have made submissions regarding the categorisation of the most vulnerable. In particular, the Disabled People's Organisations has cautioned against treating vulnerability as an inherent characteristic rather than something shaped by social, economic and political factors. Shelter has urged the inquiry to fully consider the impact of poor housing conditions, particularly overcrowding. The Migrants' Rights Consortium has requested express confirmation that all migrants, not just those with the formal immigration and asylum system, will be considered. The inquiry's evidence-gathering strategy for this module has included consideration for disparities in vulnerability to be explored, including those arising from housing disability and immigration status. There is also no intention for the impact of the pandemic on undocumented migrants to be expressly excluded from the module's consideration, although we recognise that obtaining reliable information in this regard may prove challenging. In light of this, amendments to the provisional scope to reflect these submissions are not proposed at this stage. but the inquiry will continue to take these considerations into account in the implementation of its evidence-gathering process. And finally on this topic, lessons learned and innovations. Several core participants, including the Trades Union Congress, Shelter, and the Disabled People's Organisations, have stressed the importance of ensuring Module 10 is not solely retrospective, but also identifies positive lessons from the pandemic. This perspective is welcomed. As outlined in the provisional outline of scope, Module 10 will seek to identify societal strengths and resilience that mitigated harm, and the inquiry remains committed to ensuring that positive lessons from the pandemic are not overlooked. So I turn now, my lady, to deal with the inquiry's approach to gathering information and evidence. We are committed to conducting an evidence-based investigation into the societal impact of the pandemic. This work will involve gathering information and evidence from a wide range of sources to ensure that the experiences of individuals, communities, and organisations are fully captured. As outlined earlier, the information gathering and evidence gathering processes will include the use of roundtable events, a systematic evidence review, expert material, Rule 9 requests, and Every Story Matters. Careful consideration will be given to which method or methods of investigation are appropriate for each aspect of the module's scope. Roundtables. These are a core part of the inquiry's information gathering strategy for Module 10. These sessions are one of the methods being deployed to enable a diverse range of organisations to provide their perspectives on the societal impact of the pandemic. A total of 9 roundtables are planned, with the first being held this month and the final roundtable due to take place in June of this year. The roundtable events will cover the following topics. The Faith Groups and Places of Worship Roundtable will examine the experiences of religious institutions and faith communities due to closures and restrictions on worship and adaptations during the pandemic. The Key Workers Roundtable will hear from organisations representing key workers across a wide range of sectors about the unique pressures and risks they faced during the pandemic. The Domestic Abuse Support and Safeguarding Roundtable will engage with organisations that support victims and survivors of domestic abuse to understand how lockdown measures and restrictions impacted access to support services and their ability to provide assistance to those that needed it the most. The Funerals, Burials and Bereavement Support Roundtable will explore the effects of restrictions on funerals and how bereaved families navigated their grief during the pandemic. The Justice System Roundtable will address the impact on those in prisons and detention centres and those affected by court closures and delays. The Hospitality, Retail, Travel and Tourism Industries Roundtable will engage with business leaders to examine how closures, restrictions and the reopening measures impacted these critical sectors. The Community-Level Sport and Leisure Roundtable will investigate the impact of restrictions on community-level sports, fitness and recreational activities. The Cultural Institutions Roundtable will seek to investigate the effects of closures and restrictions on museums, theatres and other cultural institutions. And finally, the Housing and Homelessness Roundtable will explore how the pandemic affected housing insecurity, eviction protections, and homelessness support services. Each roundtable will be chaired by a senior member of the Inquiry Secretariat, with discussions facilitated by an external provider to ensure a structured and productive dialogue. A report summarising the discussions will be produced for each roundtable and shared with core participants to inform the investigation. Core participants have generally welcomed the inclusion of roundtable events as a means of gathering information and facilitating discussions among affected groups. However, several core participants have raised questions regarding gaps in representation, breadth of topics covered, and the format of discussions. The inquiry welcomes the feedback on the roundtable events and will reflect on the issues raised. Further, some core participants have made submissions about the location and/or accessibility of the roundtable events, which the inquiry has carefully considered. Having regard to logistics and available resources, the in-person roundtable events are being, where possible, held at Dorland House here in London. Some roundtables will be taking place by remote attendance, and there will be a facility for attendees to participate virtually. The inquiry will remain mindful of ensuring that voices from across all sectors of society are included in the investigation for this module and will carefully consider how different organisations can contribute to roundtable discussions or otherwise engage with the investigation. The systematic evidence review. The inquiry is aware that the topic of mental health and well-being in the pandemic has been a very substantial area of scientific inquiry, with a large number of studies having been published that cover these topics. The inquiry is commissioning a systematic evidence review to provide a detailed and comprehensive analysis of the available research on the societal impact of the pandemic insofar as it relates to mental health and well-being of the general population. Following a competitive procurement process, the inquiry has appointed the Centre for Strategic and Evaluation Services to undertake this. They have previously led work for the European Parliament on the socio-economic consequences of the pandemic, have led a mental health evidence review for the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, and evaluations of government policies for other departments. The review will compare changes in the mental health and well-being of the population during the pandemic against pre-pandemic trends, focusing on UK research and identifying any risk and protective factors for changes and whether there were any disparities in mental health outcomes based on equality characteristics. The key questions that the review will consider are: how did the general adult population's mental health and well-being change during the pandemic, if at all, compared to pre-pandemic trends? And what were the risk and protective factors for changes in mental health and well-being during the pandemic relative to pre-pandemic trajectories? The review will also seek to identify the influence of factors such as behaviours or activities that have a positive impact on mental health, such as physical activity levels, participation in cultural activities, and participation in religious worship. And the relationships between mental health and well-being and other characteristics, such as age, disability, sex, race, pregnancy and maternity, gender reassignment, religion and belief, sexual orientation, socio-economic status, geographical differences, clinically vulnerable and clinically extremely vulnerable, occupation, immigration status, residential status, and other vulnerable populations such as those in prison or those with severe mental illness. This systematic review will culminate in a detailed written report which will present the findings of the review, and a copy of this report will be provided to core participants. Core participants broadly support the systematic evidence review as a means of gathering research on the impact of the pandemic on mental health and well-being. A number of core participants have made suggestions about the areas of potential inclusion regarding the systematic review for Module 10, and these will be given careful consideration. Some of these are as follows. The DA Group suggests that the systematic review should include published research on the effects of the pandemic and lockdown on both victims and survivors of domestic violence, and the effects on their mental health of those victims and survivors. In addition, the DA Group requests that research into the disproportionate impact on Black, minoritised and migrant victims and survivors, including their access to healthcare, be incorporated. The DA Group also makes submissions that the systematic review ought to include research into access to domestic abuse services and any increased demand on such services, including access to healthcare, housing services, police responses to domestic abuse, and the accessibility of the justice systems, both during and after the pandemic. The submissions from the Justice Sector Coalition request that the systematic review should include consideration of the following: the effects on lack of access to justice, particularly in the aftermath of lockdown, the effects of the lack of legal aid, key workers and effects on mental health, the amount of unrepresented people in all courts and immigration tribunals, the increased demand post-lockdown on immigration, civil and family services, if any, the disconnection from support services and social isolation, the reality of insufficient data collected by the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice on these issues, and the shift to remote hearings and the impact of those who are digitally excluded or have data poverty. The Prison and Immigration Detention Advocacy Group makes submissions that a systematic evidence review be considered in the context of both prisoners and people in immigration detention who ought to be among the demographic groups that are identified for consideration. They also suggest that the position of those incarcerated be considered when assessing the impact of the pandemic on physical activity and the lack of access to support services. And the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK and Northern Ireland invited the inquiry to provide core participants with further information as to the criteria for this process and the nature of the expertise that is sought. We are grateful to all the submissions made by core participants regarding the systematic evidence review. The inquiry recognises the value of ensuring that the systematic evidence review is as comprehensive as possible while remaining manageable and methodologically robust. The systematic review is intended to be an expansive piece of research as the inquiry acknowledges the vast amount of available data regarding the impact of the pandemic and restrictions on the well-being and mental health of the population. While it is not practical for Module 10 to carry out a similar systematic evidence review on all the topics within the provisional outline of scope, other topics will be examined via other methods in line with our information and evidence gathering strategy for this module. Where core participants have identified or referred to other available research in their submissions, the inquiry will carefully consider the extent to which they have already been considered as part of our work to date, and if not, how they might inform the evidence gathering of this module. Turning to expert material and the instruction of expert witnesses. Module 10 has commenced the process of identifying the areas where expert evidence is likely to be of assistance. This process naturally benefits from early discussion with possible experts, and such discussions will help to ensure that any eventual reports are comprehensive. The inquiry is currently engaging in such discussions with those whose expertise enable them to consider the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on people from a range of specific socio-demographic backgrounds. Module 10 has instructed two psychiatric experts, Professors Jayati Das-Munshi and David Osborne, to produce a joint expert report. Professor Das-Munshi is a Professor of Social and Psychiatric Epidemiology at King's College London and an Honorary Consultant Liaison Psychiatrist. Her work focuses on mental health inequalities. Professor Osborne is a Professor of Psychiatric Epidemiology at UCL, and his work focuses on the interface between mental health and physical health. The inquiry has also identified a number of expert reports produced in previous modules which are relevant to Module 10 issues. These are being considered by the Module 10 legal team to determine the extent to which they may assist the investigation for Module 10. The identities of further instructed experts will be contained in the Solicitor to the Inquiry's update notes. Once experts are instructed, these notes will also provide further details of the topics which the experts will address in their reports, thereby enabling core participants to comment on those matters should they wish to do so. In addition to this, as in other modules, core participant organisations will have the opportunity to comment substantially on the content of a draft version of the reports. It is envisaged that any experts instructed will produce written reports and, where appropriate, they may also give oral evidence at the public hearings for Module 10. A number of core participants in their submissions have made suggestions about areas for potential expert evidence for Module 10, and these will be given careful consideration. Some of these include the following. COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK and Northern Ireland suggest expert evidence to examine the emotional, psychological and societal consequences of bereavement during the pandemic and on the availability, accessibility and adequacy of bereavement support services during and after the pandemic. They also request that an expert should be instructed to examine the cumulative impact of bereavement, financial hardship and social inequalities. The Trades Union Congress request expert evidence to examine the impact of outsourced and agency work upon key workers and the role this may have played in terms of inequality of impact. Shelter encouraged the inclusion of expert evidence addressing the intersection of homelessness and poor housing with race and other inequality issues. Mind suggests the instruction of experts with sufficient experience of working with a diverse range of patients across a range of mental health settings in England and Wales. The DA group requests the instruction of experts to examine both the impact of the pandemic on those with pre-existing mental health conditions who experienced domestic abuse, those who experienced domestic abuse and, as a result, experienced an effect on their mental health. The Justice Sector Coalition requests expert evidence to examine access to frontline advice and legal services, particularly for those vulnerable groups, including those with mental health needs. They also make submissions that expert evidence on the relationship between access to justice and health outcomes during the pandemic ought to be explored. The Prison and Immigration Detention Advocacy Group makes submissions for expert psychiatric evidence to be obtained in the context of both prisoners and people in immigration detention, and submits that at least one of the experts should have expertise in the field of psychiatry, specifically in the context of both immigration and criminal incarceration. The Disabled People's Organisations request expert evidence to examine the following. The impact of loneliness on pre-existing mental health issues for those isolated and shielding, the impact of other aspects of the pandemic response on the mental health and well-being of disabled people, the impact on disabled people detained under the Mental Health Act 2007, and the mental health impact on young people insofar as it supplements matters to be considered in Module 8. The Disabled People's Organisations also request that any expert report should be informed by the social model of disability. The COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK and Northern Ireland request psychiatric evidence relating to the impact on the bereaved, and that expert evidence should be obtained on the emotional, psychological and social consequences of bereavement during the pandemic and on the availability, accessibility and adequacy of bereavement support services, and in addition, that any expert should examine the cumulative impact of bereavement, financial hardship and social inequalities. We're grateful for all of the submissions made by the core participants and will continue to consider these submissions as our investigation progresses. Our investigation is and will remain dynamic, and the inquiry is continuing to consider which other aspects of the provisional scope would benefit from expert evidence. Core participants will be kept updated on expert instructions via the monthly update provided. Rule 9 requests. The inquiry is at an advanced stage in relation to issuing the first tranche of formal requests for evidence, pursuant to Rule 9 of the Inquiries Rule of 2006, to a number of individuals and organisations which appear to have an important role in matters relevant to Module 10. The inquiry is grateful to core participants for identifying potential recipients of Rule 9 requests and will consider these as part of the ongoing investigation. The inquiry does not intend to share any Rule 9 requests with core participants. This is on the basis that disclosure to core participants of the Rule 9 requests themselves, as opposed to the relevant documents and materials generated by them, is neither required by the rules nor generally established in past practice. However, the Module 10 lead solicitor will continue to keep core participants informed about the progress of Rule 9 requests via the monthly update notes. The Module 10 team is considering not only the requests already made by other inquiry modules, but also those made by the Scottish inquiry. This process means that it may take a little more time to issue Rule 9 requests to Scottish bodies, but it is hoped that this process will avoid unnecessary repetition as between the inquiries. In that regard, on the 23rd of February 2022, the inquiry published a Memorandum of Understanding setting out how this inquiry and the Scottish COVID-19 inquiry intend to work effectively together. And I'm aware that your ladyship has met with the chair of the Scottish inquiry, Lord Brailsford, to discuss the constructive ways in which the two inquiries can collaborate and cooperate. And finally on this topic, every story matters and its role within Module 10. This is the inquiry's nationwide listening exercise. The inquiry's terms of reference make clear that although the inquiry will not investigate individual cases of harm or death in detail, listening to the accounts and experiences of the bereaved families and others who suffered hardship or loss will inform the inquiry's understanding of the impact of the pandemic and the response, and of lessons to be learned. Every story matters is therefore the process by which the public can contribute to the inquiry, so that it will be able not just to hear the voices of the people of the UK and to reflect upon their experiences, but also to incorporate the emerging themes into its work. Contributions provided through Every Story Matters will be analysed and turned into themed reports called records, which are submitted into each relevant investigation. These reports will be anonymised, disclosed to the inquiry's core participants, and used in evidence. The reports are expected to identify trends and themes and include illustrative case studies, which will assist in bringing a personalised viewpoint to different themes of impact. Every Story Matters records have already been used in hearings for Modules 3 and 4. It is not too late for anyone to contribute. Although the public events phase has now ended, Every Story Matters wishes to obtain insights and information from anyone in the UK and over 18 who was impacted by the pandemic and wishes to share their experience. There are different ways for people to share their experience of the pandemic with the inquiry. This can be done via our web form and a variety of alternative formats, including easy read and paper forms. The inquiry acknowledges the helpful submissions provided by core participants, particularly in relation to the range of experiences to be reflected in the ESM records and the need to capture the experiences of various groups whose voices are seldom heard. Module 10 is giving careful consideration to these matters and will provide a further update in the coming weeks. My penultimate topic this morning is disclosure. In common with the approach taken in previous modules, Module 10 will adopt the following approach to disclosure. All core participants will receive all documents disclosed in Module 10, not just those documents relevant to them. Disclosure will be subject to 3 procedures. Firstly, a relevance review so that only relevant documents are disclosed. Second, a deduplication exercise. And third, redactions in accordance with the inquiry's redactions protocol. Disclosure is likely to be in tranches made on a rolling basis, and it will be made via the electronic data management and disclosure system, Relativity. Disclosure updates will be provided by the Module 10 solicitors team, informing core participants of the progress which has been made in obtaining relevant documents. And we will also provide a further update at the next preliminary hearing. The inquiry has begun by reviewing documents received from previous modules that have been identified as having potential relevance to Module 10 issues. The process of disclosure to core participants in this module is anticipated to begin in late spring this year. The inquiry will be asking document providers to locate and disclose documents that are likely to be relevant to the Module 10 investigation. Where the inquiry has any queries or concerns about a provider's processes for locating relevant documents, it will raise them and pursue them, and of course, as documents are reviewed and gaps identified, further documents will be sought. Should the need arise, then your ladyship has the power to compel the production of documents under Section 21 of the Inquiries Act. In addition to which, there are provisions in Section 35 of the Inquiries Act which makes it an offence during the course of an inquiry for a person to do anything to alter or distort a relevant document or prevent any relevant document being produced to the inquiry, or to intentionally destroy, suppress or conceal a relevant document. With regards to the disclosure generally, the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK and Northern Ireland request that the inquiry should set a firm deadline by which the bulk of Module 10 disclosure will be completed, and request that this should be no later than 2 months before the start of the module. The inquiry understands that disclosure is only meaningful if it is provided in good time, allowing both the inquiry and core participants to properly review material and make informed contributions. The inquiry will remain focused on timely disclosure to ensure an effective process. And finally, my lady, I turn to future hearing dates and other matters. As you know, the current plans are for a further preliminary hearing for Module 10 to take place here at Dorland House towards the end of this year, and then for the public hearings to take place here over 3 weeks in early 2026. Further timetabling details will be provided by way of an update to core participants and announced on the inquiry's website once those details are finalised. My lady, I know that once you have had an opportunity to consider the written submissions and those that are going to be made orally to you today, you will publish any appropriate directions in due course. It is a matter for your discretion as to whether any of the written submissions received by you should be published on the inquiry's website. That concludes all of the matters upon which I wish to address you this morning. Your ladyship has received written submissions from 13 core participants, many of which have been referred to within my oral address. I understand that 12 core participants also wish to address my lady orally, and so unless I can assist you any further, may I invite you to hear firstly from Miss Stone, who represents the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Blackwell. Certainly, Ms Stone, I'll be grateful to hear what you have to say. Could I just say this as on behalf, as in respect of all core participants, we've got a lot to get through, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to be tough on timing, and so I urge people not to try to exceed their time estimate. Ms Stone.
My lady, good morning. Could I just check that you can hear and see and hear me okay?
Can't hear you, Miss Stone.
You can't hear me. The microphone is on.
I think it might be that seat. We
So
had
we'll
problems
keep
there
going.
before. No.
No? Still no good?
No.
No.
I'll do a thumbs up when I can hear you.
I'm grateful for that. Thank you. Can I? Nope.
My lady, can you hear me?
I can. This happened before.
Yes, I'm going to invite Miss Stone to come and take my place.
Yeah, we had it with Miss Campbell, who did had to do exactly the same.
I think so. Okay. Some tissues there.
Sorry about this, Ms. Stone. Nothing personal, I assure you.
No, I did actually see it happen to Ms. Campbell, so I wasn't primed, but I understood what was happening. Lady, you can see and hear me okay now, I trust. Good morning, and I'm mindful of what you say, milady, about time. As you know, I represent COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK, which comprises a wide range of around 7,000 people who are bereaved by COVID-19 across the UK. And as you also know well, the goal of CBFFJ UK has always been to establish the truth about how our members' loved ones died, to participate effectively in the pursuit of that truth, and in doing so to ensure accountability and prevent future deaths. Within this inquiry, we seek to assist you in achieving those goals, milady, and we welcome the opportunity to participate in and assist you with this important last module of the inquiry. Milady, you're familiar with that background, and also, I think, with our overarching procedural submissions, including those, for example, on disclosure, which have been addressed by Ms. Blackwell, King's Counsel, this morning. As always, we'd be keen to work in partnership with your team to ensure that this module is rigorous and thorough. And in this regard, milady, we note that we're still at an early stage in this module, and we respectfully agree with the TUC written submission that the length of hearings that will ultimately take place should be kept under review. Milady, this morning, could I address you briefly, please, on 3 topic areas? The first is scope, the second is the systematic review and expert evidence, and the third is the evidence of the bereaved. On the first, scope, this module, rightly in our respectful submission, seeks to address the impact of the pandemic on the population as a whole, with particular focus on a number of groups affected in different ways, including the bereaved. We support the inquiry in its intention to consider the specific impact on other groups, including key workers and those who are disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And we would submit that this can only be done effectively by considering pre-existing inequalities, considering structural and institutional discrimination, and how those inequalities were exacerbated both by the pandemic and also by the response to it, and how we can address and mitigate those impacts for the future. Milady, as you've heard throughout this inquiry, the time to do this work is now, and we submit that the inquiry must be a strong force in driving those efforts. Milady, our members come from across UK society, and many of them were directly affected by the pandemic, not only through their bereavement, although that was profound, but also from their particular perspectives, for example, as key workers or as members of minoritized communities. And those intersectional impacts will be a key aspect, I know, of your investigation in this module. Lady, the written submissions emphasise the singularity of the experience of bereavement in the pandemic. And I know, again, this is something that you will have well in mind, including as a result of the evidence that you've heard to date in other modules. As our written submissions have it, our families navigated grief in circumstances where restrictions on hospital visits, funerals, other rituals deeply altered the experience of bereavement and mourning, depriving the bereaved of the solace which many of us find in those rituals and increasing the trauma associated with profound loss. This was also a context in which social networks were disrupted and access to bereavement support services was often limited. So this impact, in both its personal and societal impacts, must be examined in this module as a formal record and also as a means of learning both what went right and, crucially, what can and be and should be improved for the next pandemic. It's clear, milady, that the impact of bereavement will have been experienced differently for different people, and we again welcome the inquiry's commitment to identify and consider where the impact was disproportionately felt and how we might address that for the future. We appreciate, milady, that you have carefully considered how best to fulfil your terms of reference through the modular structure of the inquiry. However, the pandemic doesn't lend itself easily to being neatly divided into sections, and no one I know is more aware of the cross-cutting nature of many of these issues than you, milady. But that has particular resonance in this module, which, as you prefigured in your opening remarks, requires you to examine how many of the issues which by then you'll have heard evidence about impacted society as a whole. And in our written document, we've touched on two particular areas where this arises, and we submit that your Module 10 consideration of impact should consider firstly, how disruptions to children and family life, including education, and secondly, the economic impacts of the pandemic affected the experience of the bereaved and other focus groups. And we welcome the indication from Ms. Blackwell this morning that your team is mindful of the potential relevance of those modules 8 and 9 here. Turning then to the second topic, which is the systematic review and expert evidence. As to the systematic review, we welcome the provision of further information this morning, and we will take that information away and reflect upon it. We do invite the inquiry to provide further opportunities for input from core participants on that process, including the bereaved, before the process is finalised. As to expert evidence, we pause here to note the value of this evidence in the modules you've heard to date, and submit that again in Module 10 this is likely to provide you with crucial information to assist in your wide-ranging scope of inquiry. We'd submit substantively that expert evidence from Module 2 on inequalities should inform the investigations on Module 10, with proper consideration with input from core participants on whether supplementary reports should be sought from the experts that you instructed in Module 2 of the inquiry. The second substantive submission I make is one that Ms. Blackwell has again mentioned this morning, which is one of expert evidence relating to impact on the bereaved. And we would submit that this is necessary in at least two respects. The first being expert evidence to assist you in understanding how bereavement, loss and grief are fundamentally changed by the experience of loss in a pandemic situation, what that particular context does to the grieving process. And we would submit that that will inform your understanding of mental health impacts of the pandemic and how we might prepare better for the future to mitigate those adverse impacts. The second submission we make in respect of expert evidence is that we would invite you to obtain an overview of the range of the bereavement support services across the UK, their effectiveness during the pandemic and what would be in place in a future emergency, to include in our respectful submission practical suggestions for improvement for the future to assist you in making robust recommendations. And we appreciate, again, the indication from Ms. Blackwell that those submissions will be considered. Finally, milady, may I turn to the key topic of evidence from the bereaved. Milady, in our submission, your inquiry to date has been enriched by hearing directly from those who've been affected by the topic areas under consideration, including the bereaved. And their powerful evidence has provided an essential reminder of the human impact of COVID. And there is a particular imperative in our respectful submission to hear that evidence in this module, which is dedicated to the impact on the population. In our submission, whatever their value as a parallel process, the roundtables and similar processes are no substitute for oral evidence. We also emphasise in our written submissions the need to ensure that those processes are truly inclusive and trauma-informed, and we welcome the indication this morning that the core participant submissions on those processes will be reflected upon by your team. As far as oral evidence is concerned, though, from the perspective of COVID bereaved families for Justice UK, you've heard most recently from Jean Rossiter in Module 4, who was able to articulate a number of her concerns and those of the wider group around the provision of vaccines and therapeutics for COVID-19. As well as her powerful evidence about the experience of her son Peter, a teacher, a key worker, and the depth of her loss, she said this: I believe all of our families really deserve to be heard and for those cases to be taken into account. My lady, we submit that this has resonance throughout your inquiry and particularly in this module. We recognise the inquiry's position in respect of individual cases, although our members remain concerned about the lack of effective mechanisms to examine individual deaths during the pandemic, and we invite you to include mechanisms of investigation as part of the inquiry's consideration of the impact of bereavement in this module. But may I finish, my lady, by repeating the call made in writing by us and other court participants for the inquiry to prioritise calling a significant number of witnesses who were directly affected and whose lives were profoundly changed by this pandemic. It can never be comprehensive, but a diverse range of accounts will in our submission assist you in fully appreciating those impacts. We submit that giving due prominence in the hearings to the voices of those impacted, including the bereaved, is essential both to that understanding but also to ensuring that the public recognises their importance and centrality to this inquiry. My lady, unless I can assist you any further, those are my submissions.
I'm extremely grateful, Ms Stone, very helpful. In relation to the circumstances of individual deaths, as you will know, and I'm sure you've advised your clients, I'm forbidden to investigate by my terms of reference, but I do understand the points you made about bereavement during the time of pandemic, and I'm very grateful to you.
Thank you.
Right, we'll break now, and I shall return at 5 to 12. Thank you.
My lady, I think we're now ready to turn to Miss McDermott, who will address you on behalf of COVID bereaved Families for Justice Northern Ireland.
Thank you very much. Ms McDermott, I hope your microphone's working.
Hopefully so, my lady. I certainly can hear myself.
Okay.
My lady, thank you. I represent the Northern Ireland COVID Bereaved Families for Justice, led by Peter Wilcott KC, Brenda Campbell KC, and instructed by PA Duffy Solicitors. And may I start by thanking you for the opportunity to address you on Module 10. Now, my lady, I note your comments this morning about being tough on time limits, and you can fully appreciate you'll have no cause to be tough on me today. My lady, you are all too aware of the written submissions that we've already presented, and we were grateful for the thoughtful way in which they were addressed by this morning by Ms Blackwell KC. Our message, however, remains clear. The primary mission of the Northern Ireland COVID Bereaved Family for Justice has and always will be to expose the failures within the systems that left our loved ones vulnerable to a deadly virus. These systems tragically did not protect them, and in turn the pain suffered by those left behind is profound. We firmly believe that things could and should have been different. The UK could have been better prepared. Families could have been better protected. From the very beginning, the Northern Ireland COVID Bereaved Families for Justice have striven to contribute meaningfully to this inquiry, and today's submissions are made in the same spirit of a constructive collaboration, and as always, to echo and adopt the powerful submissions made by Ms Stone this morning for the COVID Bereaved UK team. For our clients, Module 10 is a critical juncture in this process. It offers the crucial opportunity to explore not just the pain of loss, but the breakdown in support systems and, most importantly, the lessons that must be learned to ensure this never happens again. The experience of bereavement during the pandemic was a uniquely harrowing one. Grieving families found themselves in a world where the very rituals that sustained us through loss for centuries were ripped away. The absence of these practices, the denial of traditional wakes and funerals, and the inability to gather for a final farewell, these were more than just inconveniences. They were wounds upon wounds. In a time of loss, families were left isolated and abandoned, forced to navigate their grief alone. As you are aware, the restrictions placed upon us during this time and the inconsistent, often illogical nature of these rules meant that our family group were not just a minor inconvenience, they were a cruel denial of the human need to say goodbye. Within our group, we've heard from countless families about the crushing heartbreak of not being able to lay loved ones to rest in the way they should have been, surrounded by family, with the support of a community. Instead, families were made to feel as though their loved ones, already taken by the virus, were nothing more than a dangerous object, treated as hazardous waste rather than cherished people. One poignant account is that of Claire Smith, who told the heart-wrenching story of how her mother was sealed in a body bag, placed in a coffin and taken away by the funeral home. Claire had no choice but to leave her mother behind. She was not allowed to bring her home, and it was though her mother was treated as a threat, even in death. The funeral was limited to just 15 people, and at the crematorium they were forced to watch the service from a distance, watching on by way of video link. Was it really impossible to even shelter those who came to mourn, to allow them smallest of comfort of being together, if only in spirit? Anita Milliken, another of our clients, has shared devastating ongoing effects of her father's death. Her family's grief is raw and her mother continues to struggle with the trauma. Anita's words echo the anguish that so many families feel. Our lives are shattered. Loss has a lasting impact, and the removal of traditional mourning rituals left families as though adrift, orbiting the grief with no tether to steady them. Those customs, which have supported us for generations, are not merely for the dead, they're for the living, for the ones left behind. To strip away those rituals was to strip away the very foundation that helps us heal. It left families suspended in grief without the community support that should have been theirs. I'm very grateful to Miss Blackwell KC for her submissions this morning, recognising the impact, as she so eloquently put it, the lack of support structure that are so fundamental to the human experience. And we note the inclusion within this module of the restrictions and arrangements for funeral and burial arrangements and post-bereavement support. To that end, it is essential that Module 10 considers the deep emotional toil of this bereavement. It's not just about the loss of life, it's about the loss of everything that should have helped people mourn. We believe it is imperative that the inquiry addresses these devastating realities so that no other family has to suffer in this way. And to that end, I echo Ms Stone's submissions and implore your ladyship to hear as many voices as you can. It is only then that you can truly feel the texture of their experience. As we have seen in the testimonies from other members of the COVID bereaved Families for Justice, both in Northern Ireland and across the UK, bereavement during the pandemic didn't occur in isolation. It was compounded by financial hardship, educational disruption, and the broader societal inequalities that so many are already grappling with. The financial devastation of losing a loved one, especially for those in precarious employment, was made infinitely worse by the pandemic's relentless toll. Many families not only mourned the death of a loved one, they also found themselves plunged into poverty, unable to make ends meet. Regrettably, it is common case that Northern Ireland has some of the poorest areas in the United Kingdom, historically suffering from lack of budgetary planning, given the various absences in government, most recently between 2017 to 2020, and then again from February 2022 until February 2024. And that therefore follows that the implementation of effective economic measures to assist those most vulnerable is perhaps even more significant in Northern Ireland than any other part in the UK, given its already susceptible economic state. Furthermore, Northern Ireland, together with other devolved administrations, is inextricably linked financially to the UK Treasury, both during peacetime and during pandemic. These decisions, made by the UK Treasury, had a significant impact in the nature and time of economic interventions in all of the devolved governments during the pandemic. And the lack of autonomy in such vital issues for Northern Ireland means that fair and balanced economic interventions by the UK government during the COVID carried even more importance than it otherwise would. In addition, the interruption of education for children and young people, many of whom lost parents or caregivers, was devastating. The emotional burden of losing a parent while already struggling with an educational system in chaos compounded the anguish. For families already dealing with grief of losing someone they loved, the financial and educational impact was almost too much to bear. Whilst the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved Families for Justice were not CP to Module 8, we do have a particular interest in, and importantly, can assist issues that perhaps we would suggest this inquiry is now best to consider in Module 10, and that is the extent to which Northern Ireland Assembly planned and considered the impact of the pandemic on children and young people. Many of our group have profound experiences of their children and grandchildren suffering severe mental health issues because of the pandemic. Many children and young people were wholly unable to cope with the anxiety of the pandemic, including coping with bereavement and tragedy in their families. For many, experience not before or immediately anticipated, and an inability to seek comfort and mourn with others because of the lack of funeral rites and challenges in dealing with the shock and trauma of losing a loved one who previously was physically fit and healthy. Singularly and accumulatively, these experiences strip children of their resilience, which has led to long-term mental health problems brought about by the trauma they've experienced. I note the comments made by Ms Black KC this morning in respect of matters which will be considered in Module 8, will not naturally be revisited in Module 10, but we do feel we have contribution to make on this topic and invite your ladyship to extend the inquiry's examination in this respect under the guise of mental health and/or ongoing long-term impact. We urge the inquiry to consider these intersections to explore not just the immediate effects of bereavement, but the long-lasting, multifaceted repercussions that ripple through society. We are aware of the inquiry's plans to gather information through roundtable events, and Every Story Matters, but we strongly believe that these events must be conducted with great care. Bereaved families need an environment where they can speak freely, without fear of re-traumatisation. We urge that these events be organised with guidance of professionals trained in bereavement support to ensure that they're conducted in a sensitive and compassionate way. Fundamentally, the voices of the bereaved must be at the heart of this module. We cannot allow for the voices of ordinary people who've suffered loss. We cannot allow the voices of ordinary people, those who suffered the greatest losses, to be drowned out. Politicians may have had their say, but it's the lived experience of those left behind, the families of the lost, that must drive this inquiry forward. Therefore, voices must not only be heard, but also be prioritised. To that end, we note the clarification from Ms Blackwell KC this morning, setting out the proposed arrangements for the roundtable meetings, but we continue to be concerned that an unfortunate and unwanted side effect of the approach taken may be to add to the perception of many of the group that I represent that Northern Ireland issues, albeit not intentionally, have been sidelined during the course of the inquiry. Finally, we stress that the inquiry must include expert evidence on emotional, psychological and social consequences of bereavement during the pandemic. The pandemic's impact on families was not just an abstract statistic, it was felt in the hearts and minds of those who were left to pick up the pieces. We must understand the full breadth of this pain, and we urge the inquiry to bring in expertise necessary to fully grasp the scope of emotional and social toll that has been borne. We note the comments made by Ms Blackwell KC that our submissions in respect of expert evidence are under continued consideration as your investigation progresses. In conclusion, my lady, the pandemic was not only a time of loss, it was a time when the very systems meant to support us failed. For the bereaved families, it was a time when grief became almost unbearable, compounded by trauma of isolation, financial hardship, and societal disruption. We urge you to centre the voices of the bereaved in Module 10 and to ensure that the lessons learned from their suffering guide the response to a future crisis. My lady, those are submissions made on behalf of the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms McDermott. Very, very grateful. Mr Stanton's next, I think.
Thank you, my lady. I hope you can hear me. My lady, these submissions are made on behalf of the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice Cymru and concern the nature of the impact evidence to be provided by the bereaved. The group welcomes the inquiry's intention to hold roundtable events and to utilise the accounts provided through the Every Story Matters process. However, we suggest that the most effective and public means of considering the impacts on the bereaved will be to allow sufficient time within the inquiry's hearings for these issues to be comprehensively and sensitively addressed in a public forum. As outlined in the group's Module 6 submissions on impact evidence in relation to care homes, the group's view is that it will not be sufficient for a single group member to summarise the collective experiences of bereaved families, and that to do justice to the impacts experienced, it will be necessary to take a range of witness statements from bereaved group members. We suggest that this could be achieved with somewhere in the region of between 10 to 15 witness statements from each group, from which a lesser number of witnesses could be selected for oral evidence, and that these statements could be kept to a manageable length. We also suggest that the same process for obtaining impact evidence could be managed across Modules 6 and 10. The Cymru Group entirely accepts that it is outside the scope of the inquiry to investigate and determine individual circumstances of harm and death. However, we submit that it will be important to obtain a range of statements and to hear from a number of witnesses at inquiry hearings for the following reasons. First, to properly understand the full range of the devastating impacts experienced. Second, as part of a process of catharsis, alongside initiatives such as Every Story Matters, particularly for the members of the bereaved family groups who have campaigned so tirelessly for so long and have been so active within the inquiry's proceedings. Third, while it is appreciated that the inquiry is able to receive evidence in a number of forms and gives careful consideration to all information provided, the hearings are widely seen as the gold standard, and it will be important for impact evidence from the bereaved to be taken in this forum. Fourth, because of the sheer scale of these impacts on the population of the country, with millions of people having experienced bereavement during the pandemic. And fifth, impact evidence illuminates and gives context to many of the complex and technical issues that the inquiry is required to consider. For example, in Module 3, the inquiry heard evidence from a physiotherapist who provided close personal care to a patient with COVID-19 in the first wave of the pandemic, and who specifically requested an FFP3 respirator to protect against infection. This was refused and led to the physiotherapist becoming infected and developing long COVID, with devastating ongoing consequences for her professional and personal life. We suggest that impact evidence such as this, which crystallises the real-life consequences of technical and contentious issues, such as aerosol transmission and the precautionary principle, has been invaluable to the inquiry's understanding, and that impact evidence from bereaved groups will have a similar evidential significance. For example, the experiences of many families when a parent with underlying health issues was admitted to hospital for treatment during the pandemic, knowing that this was the least safe place for them to be because of the poor state of NHS estates and the inability to control infection in these environments, and the terrible foreboding, as their worst fears were realised when their loved one became infected while in hospital and in too many cases tragically died. The group's written submissions set out a lengthy list of impacts experienced, from which I propose to highlight just 3 issues to further illustrate the benefits of impact evidence in helping the inquiry determine complex and contentious issues, all of which might also form the basis of recommendations for the future. The first is the lack of information provided to families about the circumstances in which their loved one died and the subsequent handling of complaints. Given the circumstances in which people in hospitals and care homes died, often alone due to visiting restrictions, many families understandably sought further information. However, the responses provided were often insufficient, incomplete, and contradictory. And in many cases, this led to formal complaints, which were themselves characterised by insufficient and contradictory responses. The failure to provide timely, accurate, and sufficient information can sometimes lead to grieving families constructing their own narratives to fill the vacuum out of a need for closure. But without access to the full facts, these narratives are not always accurate, and it can often take many years for the truth to be established, if at all. The group suggests that the inquiry's understanding of these issues and the way that bereavement is prolonged and exacerbated by the failure to provide adequate and timely information would benefit from expert evidence, particularly so the inquiry is able to make recommendations for improvements in this area. Issues specific to Wales in this regard are the National Nosocomial COVID-19 programme, established in April 2022, which the Cymru Group had understood would comprehensively investigate individual deaths from nosocomial infection, but was subsequently limited to a thematic review and an inadequate 24-page final report. Separately, the NHS duty of candour was only introduced in Wales in April 2023, 5 years after Scotland and 3 years after England. And also, the lack of a strong voice in Wales to speak on behalf of patients, which is particularly important given the deficiencies in the provision of information, the inadequate investigations and complaints processes, and the absence of effective regulation in Wales. The second issue is the quality of bereavement support services within health and social care settings in Wales. There have been a number of initiatives since the pandemic. However, they have failed to deliver the change needed because of a lack of engagement with families and a lack of learning from the awful experiences of the pandemic. In this respect, the group asks that the inquiry considers issuing a Rule 9 request to the Welsh Government Bereavement Lead as set out in the written submissions. The group also suggests that the inquiry could usefully consider the Charter for Families Bereaved Through Public Tragedy, which was drafted in response to the Hillsborough tragedy. And again, that this is an area that would benefit from recommendations for improvement. The third issue to mention is the circumstances in which photographs of patients were taken in hospitals in Wales, which has been justified on the basis of documenting the pandemic for journalistic purposes in the public interest, but which the group says occurred without consent. The taking and subsequent publication of photographs of this type, including in morgues and of intubated and unconscious patients, where consent could not possibly have been obtained, has caused huge distress to bereaved families. While the Cymru Group does not expect the inquiry to determine any individual breaches of data protection and confidentiality, it is an issue of widespread public concern that would benefit from the inquiry's scrutiny, including the role of trusts and boards in permitting this type of activity, and the extent to which patient confidentiality can be overridden by the public interest in recording an event such as a pandemic, which the Cymru Group seriously doubts could ever be justified in the absence of express consent. Finally, my lady, a point about cross-cutting issues and evidence. By the time the inquiry hears evidence in Module 10, it will have heard and considered a huge range of evidence across 12 prior modules, as has already been mentioned. This will include significant amounts of impact evidence in a variety of forms, including witness statements, oral evidence, and documentary evidence. The group suggests that core participant groups who have participated in a number of inquiry modules are well placed to assist the inquiry to identify impact evidence from previous modules for use in Module 10, and that engagement of this kind could be managed in a proportionate way without the need for a formal protocol, and would utilise the knowledge and unique perspectives of core participants built up over a number of years at the inquiry to the inquiry's benefit. My lady, those are the submissions on behalf of the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice Cymru.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Stanton. Very helpful. Ms. Bitchell, I think you're next.
My lady,
I can hear you.
the Scottish COVID Bereaved thank the Chair for their designation as core participant in this module and are grateful to Ms Blackwell KC to the inquiry for providing a detailed note in advance of today's hearing and for the submissions this morning. We have already put our thanks for the inquiry's work and its workers in writing, and we repeat it here. I would like to address the following two matters. One, roundtable events. The bereaved hears that roundtable events are to be held in London for logistic and resource reasons. Somewhat ironically, it's for the exact same reasons in relation to their logistics and resources that the Scottish COVID bereaved would ask that a roundtable be held in Scotland. This is, of course, an inquiry for the whole of the United Kingdom, and while travel expenses are to be reimbursed, those are not the only barriers to many of the bereaved, particularly for those out with the South East of England. A one-day round table in London may necessitate 2 to 3 days away from home in Scotland. For those with, for example, childcare and other caring responsibilities, this may be a significant factor, including where they may have lost a care partner as part of their COVID experience. There are additional considerations in relation to travel for those with disabilities. The Scottish COVID bereaved asked the inquiry to consider holding a roundtable events in Scotland to allow for equal opportunity for all those who suffered to outline the impacts on the pandemic that they had. It's respectfully submitted that setting up a day in Scotland, perhaps liaising with the Scottish inquiry to minimise cost for a location to carry out a roundtable, would not be a significant budgetary strain, particularly if the alternative is that the inquiry assists with travel and accommodation for those travelling down south. Nor may it be a significantly greater logistical problem than has been faced by the inquiry before and has not been found to be insurmountable. The Scottish COVID bereaved have felt that the promise that it would truly be a four-nation inquiry has been kept, and we would ask the Chair to consider this submission in light of the foregoing. The second issue is in relation to evidence in Module 2, and perhaps the following submission will not be of surprise to my lady. It's submitted that the roundtable exercise and Every Story Matters, whilst important, cannot capture in the same way as direct evidence the impact that the pandemic had on the bereaved. One only has to recall the impact of hearing of those who have given personal evidence about their experiences and the profound effect they have had on our understanding of the effects of COVID. It was one thing to read that doctors were working beyond capacity with insufficient PPE. It was quite another to see and hear the evidence of Dr. Fong talking about it, enhancing our understanding and the impact felt of those experiences. We submit that the Chair may be assisted from more of such witnesses, hearing directly from those who suffered and those who were bereaved as a result of the pandemic. Not, of course, to explore the individual case, but, as in other modules, to explore certain common important themes. We appreciate that this may lead to a slightly longer timetable, but we would submit that it would reap considerable rewards in terms of impact. As we have mentioned before in previous submissions, in order to engage the general public and politicians to support and see merit in recommendations, there is no better way of highlighting the importance of the inquiry's work than by evidence from the people who were most greatly affected by it. Again, as noted before, the press is most positive when covering stories of those directly affected. The Scottish COVID bereaved submit that given the scope of Module 10, the inquiry should consider hearing directly perhaps from more of those witnesses impacted, and we ask the Chair to consider greater use of the impact evidence in the public hearings in this module. My lady, those are the submissions on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Mitchell. Right, I think Mr Wagner is next.
I am. Can you hear me?
I can, Mr Wagner, thank you, and I can see you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I act for Clinically Vulnerable Families, CVF, with Margarita Cornalia, and instructed by Kim Harrison and Shane Smith of Slater & Gordon. CVF represents those who are clinically vulnerable, clinically extremely vulnerable, and the severely immunosuppressed, as well as their households across all 4 nations. CVF are grateful to you, Chair, for granting ICCOR participant status, having already been granted CP status in Modules 3, 4 and 8. And CVF also thanks the inquiry team, including the staff at Dorland House, for their continuing work on this and other modules. I'll begin with the broader picture. and what the impact of society means from the perspective of the clinically vulnerable. Module 10 provides an important opportunity, we say, the final opportunity, given it's the final module, for the inquiry to take account of the severe and lasting impact that the pandemic has had on clinically vulnerable people and their families. Clinically vulnerable people had a different experience of the pandemic, being most at risk of severe injury and death from COVID-19. When society reopened for many, it did not reopen for some who were clinically vulnerable. Many remained in their homes with no choice but to shield themselves, even after formal shielding ended, from a virus which, if they became infected, would potentially lead to their deaths. There is an important point about how the inquiry frames this part of the investigation. The first part of the outline of scope refers to the measures put in place to combat the disease and any disproportionate impact. And later, it refers to restrictions imposed on various parts of society. CVF says that the more neutral wording of measures should be used going forward. The distinction is an important one, because whichever is chosen will frame the way the inquiry approaches the impact on society. Often, protective measures, such as social distancing rules, compulsory mask wearing, were described as restrictions. And the lifting of those measures was often referred to as the return of freedom. Without doubt, some felt restricted by those measures, as a seatbelt can also feel restrictive. And when seatbelts were introduced, they were seen by some as a limit on our freedom. Nobody seriously says that now. Why? Because there was a public education campaign, and more simply, there was proof that seatbelts worked. Like seatbelts, pandemic safety measures were needed to keep us safe, particularly for the millions of people at serious risk of injury or death from COVID-19. CVF doesn't say that all of those measures should have continued. Of course they shouldn't, but some could have, or some could have been developed or evolved. Why? Well, the continuing framing of safety measures as restrictions may have prevented simple measures from making us more safe, such as clean air and mask wearing, from being continued in a proportionate way in the longer term. Unfortunately, the issue of masks was dragged into a culture war, rather than being seen as an important protective public health measure. Your Ladyship heard from Dr. Finnis of CVF in her evidence in Module 3 that people who continue to wear masks to this day for health reasons now face public abuse and discrimination. The other wider consequence of this dynamic is that no serious consideration appears to have been given to what measures can be put in place now and in the medium and long term to protect the public. Speaking of the longer term, it was reassuring to hear Ms. Blackwell's KC's submission this morning that Module 10's focus on impact may include an assessment of the likely impact which may extend beyond the date range in the inquiry's terms of reference, for example, in relation to ongoing or longer-term impact. As I have submitted previously, and your Ladyship accepted in an early ruling, it's necessary to consider both present and future in order to make effective recommendations. That's just common sense. People who are particularly vulnerable to pathogens existed before COVID. But during the pandemic, for a brief moment, clinically vulnerable people became visible to everyone else. For that brief moment, the opportunity was there to educate the public, businesses and public authorities on the importance of high-quality masks, ventilation and clean air, and make steps towards lasting change in those areas. That opportunity wasn't taken. And that applies across the board. including in the spaces this module will focus on, such as courts, prisons, the hospitality sector, places of worship, the hospitality sector and places of worship. COVID-19 may no longer kill as many people as it did in 2020, but it has not transitioned to a seasonal virus, and it's still rife, as are flu, norovirus, and other airborne pathogens such as RSV. A more enlightened approach to ventilation and other safety measures would reduce the spread of all airborne infections, not just in a future pandemic, but now. Investment in those measures would also reduce the need in a future pandemic for social distancing measures and to make those spaces safer not just for high-risk people, but for everyone. The failure to do this has had profound impacts for clinically vulnerable people. Immunocompromised clinically vulnerable people have no preventive medication to rely on, and many cannot depend on vaccinations. The antivirals program is in disarray, providing little reassurance to people at higher risk of COVID-19 should they become infected. And many millions, including the majority of clinically vulnerable and formerly clinically clinically extremely vulnerable as formerly described, face being removed from the COVID vaccination program later this year. Some of those issues are wider issues for different modules, but the overall impact and the impact on society, as this module is considering, is a great loss, not just for clinically vulnerable people, but for society at large. Many clinically vulnerable people have ended up feeling excluded from a society which left them behind in the rush to escape from restrictions and towards the false promise of Freedom Day. Excluded from the workplace, from crowded and poorly ventilated spaces, and certainly from the public consciousness, from visible to invisible again. And against those wider points, I turn to the provisional outline of scope. The clinically vulnerable cannot remain invisible, and CVF are concerned that the provisional scope makes only passing reference to clinically vulnerable people without properly integrating them into the 3 provisional scope topics or into the 13 questions which the inquiry team has posed itself, albeit we've been told this morning they are very much provisional. There is no clinically vulnerable roundtable. There is no reference to clinical vulnerability in the potential instruction of experts. And we note and welcome Ms. Blackwell-KC's reassurance that the team is listening to core participant concerns. But we also note that she did not announce any changes to the scope or even the indicative questions. And it's important we submit that there are changes before the evidence gathering process properly begins. The experience of clinically vulnerable people should be considered in relation to all the subtopics in this module. This is because in every social space where the pandemic impacted, that impact was different and often more severe for those who are clinically vulnerable. That includes the places Module 10 will be investigating. CVF have proposed some amendments to the provisional scope and certain questions to ensure the experiences of clinically vulnerable people are not left out of account. So on provisional scope topic 1, we have proposed a relatively small change, adding a simple line to the long paragraph, including the impact of those who could not benefit from reopening, such as many clinically vulnerable people. And this, again, is about framing, because reopening implies, or it does more than imply, that society was open for everyone. But from the perspective of clinically vulnerable people, it simply was not. And for some, it still is not to this day. On provisional scope topic 2, it's important that the experience of clinically vulnerable key workers are covered by Module 10, because again, they had a very different experience, whether in a school or a prison or a court, to people who weren't clinically vulnerable. CVF does not propose any amendment to this topic, but assumes that any inequality in the impact of the wording of the provisional outline of scope will include consideration of clinically vulnerable key workers, given the overall focus of this module. And on provisional scope topic 3, it's important that this topic, which is about vulnerability, makes clear reference to the clinically vulnerable, not just in its text, but in its substance. And CVF is concerned that there is insufficient focus on how clinically vulnerable people will be considered within this topic, because, of course, vulnerability is a wide concept. And CVF has also raised an additional issue at paragraph 27 about the variation of support and the variation in safety measures across different parts of the UK. CVF from paragraph 28 has proposed a number of additional questions and some slight edits to some of the indicative questions that the inquiry team have posed themselves. And I don't read them out now, but they are there for your ladyship's consideration from paragraph 28 of our submissions. Expert reports. We submit that the expert evidence should explicitly cover the impact on clinically vulnerable people, both on their mental health and generally. Roundtables. It's very important to CVF that a roundtable is added to assess the impact of the pandemic on the clinically vulnerable. But in any case, clinically vulnerable representative groups should be invited to the existing roundtables. And finally, final substantive point on the length of hearing. I don't think CTI dealt with this in her submissions this morning, but it is a topic that's raised by a number of CPs. And we say simply this, that similar submissions about the length were made in the build-up to Module 4, which was also 3 weeks, which ultimately ends up being about 12 days or 11 days of evidence. And whilst the inquiry team did an excellent job of packing in the witnesses 4 or 5 per day, the inevitable impact is it reduces the length of time for questioning by core participants to very, very little, a maximum of 5 minutes, I think, in Module 4. And in my respectful submission, that should be prioritised in Module 10, particularly as this is the impact on society module. And given the breadth of topics, it may simply not be practical to do anything different, to have a module with any less than 4 or 5 witnesses per day. So I do respectfully ask that your ladyship considers that point. In conclusion, it's a mistake to see clinically vulnerable people as somehow detached from the general public. They represent millions of people. Everyone either has or had or will have a loved one who is clinically vulnerable if they're not clinically vulnerable themselves. But clinically vulnerable people have been consistently left behind and sidelined. And this is why CVF have proposed and propose again that clinical vulnerability is added as a protective characteristic in the Equality Act. This would prevent the dynamic that I have referred to, where they go in and out of visibility. Enshrining in law is one way, not the only way, but one way that clinical vulnerability can become a permanent part of institutions' consideration of safety measures, reasonable adjustments, lack of discrimination, and other matters. And whether your ladyship is initially attracted to this idea or not, we ask that consideration is at least given to supplementing the inquiry's expert evidence to include clinical vulnerability and consider what can be done better in future. Many thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Wagner. Sorry, I muted myself. I think the next person to speak is Ms. Beattie.
My lady, we act for 3 disabled people's organisations, or DPO, from across the UK. They are Disability Rights UK, Inclusion Scotland, and Disability Action Northern Ireland. The DPO thank you for recognising them as core participants in Module 10. I start with vulnerability. For Module 10, where the inquiry is setting out expressly to examine the impact of the pandemic on the most vulnerable, the DPO repeat our previous encouragement to be constructively critical about the term. We are all vulnerable at different times in different ways. Each of us may also find ourselves at one or more times in our lives, and unexpectedly, among some of the most vulnerable, as identified in Issue 3 of the Provisional Outline of Scope for Module 10, facing unsuitable or insecure housing or homelessness, being a victim of domestic abuse, or affected by the justice system. For disabled people, pre-existing inequalities determined by social, economic and political choice made the risk of such circumstances even greater and made the impact of the pandemic, including on mental health and well-being, even harsher. My lady, the combination of issues to be covered in Module 10 throws into sharp relief the social model which the DPO have advocated throughout the inquiry, which identifies the interaction of impairments or conditions with barriers and attitudes in society as hindering the full and effective participation of disabled people on an equal basis with others. The inquiry will see how, in contrast with disabled people, the rest of society generally lives without appreciation of the accommodations they enjoy, but did not recognise as such until COVID brought some of them into jeopardy. We unconsciously live with adjustments and accommodations to make our work and lifestyles possible, many of which rely on key workers to make them happen. We do not call them adjustments, but they are. Take food as an example. We might think that we can feed ourselves, but we rely on shops and services staffed at all hours by retail workers, cleaners and security guards, and supplied by distribution and transport workers and delivery drivers to provide us with access to food or to deliver it to our doors. For some, the reality of dependency and our reliance on adjustments only dawned during the pandemic. For disabled people, awareness of that reality was not new, but required navigation through what Professors Shakespeare and Watson called the triple jeopardy, from 1, the virus itself, 2, reduced care for pre-existing needs, and 3, the disproportionate impact on disabled people because of non-pharmaceutical interventions. My lady, on the approach to Module 10, the DPO make 5 points. First, disabled people are, of course, part of the general population referred to in Issue 1 of the Provisional Outline of Scope. The DPO are reassured by Counsel to the Inquiry's remarks today that there will be no inadvertent lapse into examining the impact on the mental health and well-being of the population without taking into account the triple jeopardy faced by disabled people, who form 24% of the UK population, and without considering the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on disabled people's mental health and well-being. My lady, we set out at paragraph 3.1 of our written submissions some of the many ways in which disabled people's mental health and well-being was disproportionately affected. Module 10 will also be the opportunity to examine the cumulative and compounding impact on disabled people's mental health and well-being of other aspects of the pandemic, which the inquiry will have looked at in other modules. Be that disproportionate mortality rates of disabled people, DNA CPR notices, vaccine prioritisation decisions, prolonged shielding by those who cannot take vaccines, the clinical frailty scale and ceilings of care in hospitals, school closures, or local authority easements to statutory duties under the Care Act and the Children and Families Act, all of which the inquiry will have heard about by the time of Module 10. For disabled people, these matters did not happen in isolation. They were not experienced as separate events, but were combined and felt relentless. The DPO therefore welcomed Council to the inquiry's commitment and reassurance this morning that Module 10 and the expert evidence will consider whether there were inequalities in the impact on mental health and wellbeing within and between different demographic groups, including disabled people. We invite the inquiry to ask Professors Shakespeare and Watson to provide a short report on the impact of the pandemic on disabled people to supplement their Module 2 report on the structural inequality which disabled people faced at the pandemic's outset. Second, as with the general population, disabled people are among those working in the key worker occupations in Issue 2. And the DPO urged the inquiry to consider the position of disabled workers in relation to each of the subtopics listed. One of the primary ways to avoid disease exposure at work was to work at home. But despite higher clinical vulnerability and the advent in many occupations of home working, disabled people in employment in the UK were more likely to be going out to work during the pandemic rather than working from home. And disabled people were working in occupations that were more exposed to COVID than the occupations of non-disabled workers. Of the key worker groups mentioned in the provisional outline of scope, the DPO are aware of some research suggesting that disabled workers are more likely to work in key public services, food and other necessary goods occupations and in local and national government, but less likely to work in transport. But this research also suggests that the occupational distribution of disabled workers, although particularly important given the risks faced by different occupations during the pandemic, has not been extensively explored. What is known is that 3 million disabled workers earn less than £15 an hour, with disabled people more likely to be on precarious 0 hours contracts. The position of disabled key workers must be examined, and the DPO invite the inquiry to build on the work of the TUC in their June 2021 report on disabled workers' experiences during the pandemic. This must also include the impact of interventions on key workers who have disabled family members, who faced the risk of spreading COVID if they continued to work but were unable to access alternative sources of income or financial support. Third, the DPO welcomed Council to the inquiry's confirmation that the proposed expert evidence will consider operation of mental health services at all levels, including community-based care, which we understand is not limited to people with severe mental health conditions, and inequalities of impact within and between different demographic groups. NHS digital statistics, while incomplete, suggest that during 2020 to 2021, the overall use of the Mental Health Act increased by about 4.5%. At the same time, external monitoring of institutional settings reduced as the CQC suspended on-site visits to carry out Mental Health Act monitoring reviews, which were replaced with remote monitoring via video calls. On-site visits did not start again until July 2021. Visits from family, friends and advocates were also restricted and for periods ceased totally. The DPO invite the inquiry to scrutinise what, if any, safeguarding measures were put in place to ensure those isolated in psychiatric wards were protected, and whether reasonable adjustments were made, including allowing visits from family and friends, supporting communication and digital access needs, and involving people in decision-making and co-production of care. As already envisaged, the inquiry will need to consider communal settings, other mental health services, and whether there were gaps in service provision. Fourth, on the inquiry's proposed approach to Module 10. The DPO are keen to participate in the proposed roundtable events, each of which will consider aspects of the pandemic which affected disabled people. Hearing from disabled people as participants in each of the roundtables will be an important part of the inquiry's information gathering exercise. In addition to inviting DPO to the roundtables already listed, the inquiry would likely benefit from a separate roundtable focusing on issues impacting on disabled people that have not been addressed or not addressed sufficiently in the earlier sessions. The size of the population of disabled people across the UK and the discrete issues affecting them call for that consideration. In our written submissions, the DPO have set out how disabled people are disproportionately affected when it comes to issues of housing and homelessness, as victims of domestic abuse, in prisons and other places of detention, and in the justice system. My lady, you are hearing today from other core participants on a number of these areas, and so I will not repeat those points, save to mention that in Module 2, the inquiry received relevant evidence on the pre-pandemic situation affecting disabled people. It will be for Module 10 to complete the evidence about the impact of the pandemic itself on disabled people. Fifth and finally, Module 10 will seek to identify where societal strengths, resilience and/or innovation reduced any adverse impact. For disabled people, the pandemic presented a number of innovations, some of which disabled people had long called for, but had not been realised. For example, working from home enabled many disabled people to work more or to return to work, a reasonable adjustment which should always have been available, but which only became widely accepted once the pandemic forced it upon the population as a whole. The use of masks reduced infection risk for immunocompromised people, but to be fully inclusive must take into account the needs of deaf and hearing impaired people. And resources to communicate access needs were co-designed by disabled people and achieved what pre-existing legal duties to provide accessible information did not. The inquiry has heard evidence in several modules about the benefit of DPO and other civil society groups becoming involved in co-design of policy, including at the stages of data collection, equality impact assessments, and in co-production more broadly. The DPO are keen that Module 10 explores this method of policy making beyond slogans so that it can become the ordinary way in which government works, and indeed a new way of binding state and society together. My lady, returning to the DPO's starting point for all your ladyship's modules, it was the system that was vulnerable, not people. In looking at societal strengths and innovation, the DPO caution your ladyship against seeking out individual instances of resilience. Rather, it is for systems themselves to become resilient. They achieve this by being responsive to the people they are designed to serve, responsive to the fluctuating vulnerability of the human condition in all its manifestations. The DPO welcome the opportunity to contribute to the inquiry's exploration of both innovations and potential for change in order that such system resilience can be attained and lessons learned to inform preparations for future pandemics across the UK. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Beattie. Ms Davis, if you'd like to take us up to lunch.
Thank you, my lady. Can my lady hear and see me?
Can't hear you at the moment, can't see you, but
Can you do both now?
I can hear you and see you.
I'm
Gotcha.
delighted, my lady. Thank you very much. My lady, the Domestic Abuse Group, which we've been calling the DA Group, it's important to have the full name at the beginning of the submissions. We're pleased to have been given CP status for Module 10. You will recall two of the organisations in our group, Southall Black Sisters and Solace Women's Aid, who were represented in Module 2, and they've been joined by a third organisation, Latin American Women Rights Services, or LAWS, and I don't need to explain their purpose because the name is self-explanatory. And they're represented by myself and Ms Sergides, and we're instructed by Public Interest Law Centre. These oral submissions are in addition to the group's written submissions, which we know, and indeed it was made very clear by Ms Blackwell this morning, that you and your counsel and solicitor team have taken into consideration. I want to start with the proposals for roundtables. We very much welcomed this initiative, and we hoped that a number of violence against women and girls organisations would be able to participate. And we offered in our written submissions to provide a list of possible invitees. I have to say, therefore, my lady, that we were very surprised when we received an invitation to one roundtable event on domestic abuse, and two, but not all three, of our organisations were invited to attend. And so our first ask is that the omitted group, Solace Women's Aid, receive an invitation. We do not agree that just because their services are delivered to survivors in London, that makes their experience unimportant. Between 2020 and 2020, Solace supported over 10,000 domestic abuse survivors. With SBS, they lobbied for funding to establish a crisis emergency refuge and then ran that refuge. They provide refuge accommodation directly, unlike the other two organisations. And so SBS and LAWS are pleased to have been invited to participate, but they feel strongly that Solace should also be invited, not least because SBS and LAWS are by and for organisations. They provide services by members of particular communities to those particular communities, whereas Solace has a different remit. And we say the inquiry would be depriving itself of valuable accounts of experience on the ground if Solace is not invited to the roundtable. Secondly, we are surprised that there is only one roundtable on the subject of domestic abuse and that it is only in London. And we heard explanation this morning, but we reiterate that the roundtable exercise would want to obtain a wide range of views from a national, regional and different community perspective, reflecting the diversity of those who experience domestic abuse. We support the submissions from Scotland, for example, that attendance remotely or payment of travel expenses is not the same as being able to attend roundtables more locally than that. And if roundtable meetings do take place out of London, and we are aware of resources, but we say a more representative national picture of the experience of the domestic abuse sector will be obtained, not least because many violence against women and girls organisations outside London are precisely those by and for organisations and can bring diverse voices to the table. We would suggest that the inquiry discusses directly with the domestic abuse group on invitations to the roundtables and where they could be heard, so that there's a good mix of national, regional providers and the voices of diverse communities, and we'd be delighted to cooperate with that. We also recognise, in relation to the roundtable, that the different issues, domestic abuse, justice, housing and so forth, don't entirely operate in silos. And we suggest that consideration is given so that organisations whose primary concern is one of those issues, in our case domestic abuse, are also invited to participate on housing, justice and key workers, because otherwise we believe that valuable experience will be lost. My lady, I can be shorter on my 4 other points, which are scope, further evidence gathering, disclosure and the time estimate. On scope, we urge that in issues around immigration and asylum and more broadly migrants' rights are not lost, and both ourselves and the Migrants' Rights Coalition noticed that initially in the CTI note they did appear to have dropped down. We hope that the focus on key workers will include those workers in the domestic abuse sector who were delivering frontline services and those who were not frontline but providing necessary support. We gave evidence in Module 2 of the confusion over the status for domestic abuse workers, whether they could access schooling, vaccination as key workers, etc. And we hope that the inquiry will accept that those dealing with survivors of domestic abuse are self-evidently key workers and should be treated as such, both by this inquiry and by government in future pandemics. We've made the point in written submissions that for survivors of domestic abuse, the most obvious harm from the pandemic was lockdown, which we know resulted in a significant increase in domestic abuse and difficulty in seeking help, support and a place of safety. But we also say that the overall harm of the pandemic and lockdown was more nuanced than that. It involved the potential harm to health from the virus, the isolation of lockdown, and the ability of perpetrators to use both the fear of virus and lockdown against victims. We heard Ms Blackwell today, and we appreciate that CTI recognises this is not a semantic point, but that all different harmful effects of the pandemic and of lockdown and of the other measures will be considered, and we support the point made eloquently just now by the Disabled People's Organisation around triple jeopardy, where she was effectively making the same point. On evidence gathering, we do propose that the remit of expert evidence is expanded beyond diagnosed and severe mental health conditions to include prevalence of trauma, requests for counselling services and other mental health conditions that may not have been diagnosed as severe. And our experience is that women seeking support from the domestic abuse sector reported a significant increase in the complexities of their cases and also the aggravation of mental health conditions. We stress that the approach at all stages of evidence gathering should be based on an understanding of intersectionality. Individuals suffer different types of harm during the pandemic and lockdown, depending on their different circumstances. Men were less likely to experience domestic abuse than women. Black and minoritized women's experience of domestic abuse can be different to those of white women. We agree with the point made by the Disabled People's Organisation that disabled people disproportionately experience domestic abuse. And we remind the inquiry of the triple abuse experienced by migrant survivors of domestic abuse, the pandemic and the opportunity for further control by perpetrators who can threaten reports to the Home Office or destitution. The Migrants' Rights Coalition has made a further point about the even more vulnerable position of undocumented migrants, and clearly undocumented migrant survivors of domestic abuse were in a yet further worse position, and all those different structural constraints need to be understood in relation to expert evidence, the systematic evidence review and the roundtable. And we would welcome the opportunity to suggest existing research, some of it indeed adduced by Southall Black Sisters and Solace Women's Aid in Module 2 as part of the systematic review. In Module 2, we also invited other domestic abuse organisations to give accounts of their experience and those of the survivors during the pandemic and lockdown, and we reported those to the inquiry, and if helpful, we'll be happy to repeat the exercise, and we support the submissions already made that both expert evidence and impact evidence already provided for Module 2 should be within the remit of Module 10 to consider. Finally, my final two very short points, my lady, which are practical matters. We support the suggestion that disclosure should be completed, indeed fully completed, 2 months prior to the start of the hearing, and we suggest that those documents that were disclosed in earlier modules are labelled as such, because those CPs who've been involved in earlier modules will find it much easier then to analyse the documents. And on the time estimate, we agree that 3 weeks is probably insufficient. We would have thought 4 weeks, but we think it's right to keep it under review. We reiterate that we are delighted to cooperate with any requests from the inquiry on evidence gathering or anything else, and particularly to help the inquiry on arranging the roundtables and appropriate invitees. Thank you very much, my lady.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Davies. Quite a canter. I assure those whom you represent that I will obviously bear very much in mind all that's contained in your written submissions. Very well, Ms Blackwell, shall we break now for lunch?
Yes, please.
And return at 2 o'clock, please.
Thank you.